the notion of a secondary traumatization. How is that possible? I can very well imagine how it affects somebody who hears about traumatization again and again, of other people, that this is deeply affecting someone, but can you call it a traumatization in the true sense?
Probably not. Probably not. It's one of those terms that has sort of gained acceptance. That's why I also use it, because in a descriptive way, it sort of states, okay, something really difficult happens to you, it's associated to the traumatization, but it's not primary. That's what's useful about the term. I think you're correct that actually it's not comparable. The problem is sometimes you do end up being in what is called secondary traumatization actually ends up being a primary traumatization. There are certain events you bear witness to which simply are impossible for you to work through. And sometimes the continuous experience of, for example, working in a surrounding where people suffer and you can do nothing about it. And you feel you bear witness and you try to do something, but actually you can't change anything about it. And then we got these nice words, we talk of burnout and loss of distance and whatever, which is true. But basically the problem is that at a certain time you break. And I think that can happen to helpers, to all kinds of helpers. And I think to call that sometimes to call that a secondary traumatization is an exaggeration, and sometimes it's a euphemism, because it can be just as bad or worse. Which is because trauma doesn't necessarily happen as this one-time lightning event. It happens very often in a cumulative way, you know, as you have like little drops of water which will fill the glass till the water spills, and at some point it spills, and then it'll be half full again, and then you'll fill it up again, and somehow you'll get more vulnerable. And I think it is often underestimated how extremely vulnerable we all are in these situations. And we ourselves underestimate it. A, because we want to help. B, because we have certain professional instruments with which we work. C, because since we have a task, we're usually off better than others who don't have a task. Initially, the helper is always in a better situation than everybody else, because you don't panic when you've got something to do. But sooner or later you panic also. And I think we don't pick that up enough. Yep.
You are also in a position where you're also in very strongly in a position where you get confronted with traumas of others, and therefore also you personally have to cope with it to some extent. What are your personal techniques in order for doing so? Or techniques, what is your, how do you deal with it, if I may ask?
Prayer time. My problem is I get these destructive impulses. but I guess the building of the church is stronger than me, so I'm realistic enough to control them. I guess, to your questions, I guess one learns on the long run through one's own errors. I've worked in this field a long time. There was a time when I clearly misprotected myself and paid a high price for that. And therefore I'm stricter today on this issue of self-protection. I think there are several things one can do to protect yourself. One thing is to talk to others about it. Very simple. If you need I think in this kind of work, and this goes for all of us, not only for psychologists, but for all of you also, we need to have a certain amount of omnipotence in our heads to dare to do that. We need to feel sort of, you know, you need to be rather crazy to think you can go to a country and help them make peace, right? I mean, you must have a side in you where you dare to do something really crazy on one side. But then you spend the rest of your time learning that you are not so omnipotent. So a lot of this has to do with accepting the things you can't do and how you deal with it. And I think a second issue thus is not only to have people to talk to, but to reflect on my capacity to accept of my cannot do's, cannot solve, cannot change. Third issue, I think, is a trustworthy institutional framework. I think the less institutional framework you have, worse off you are. And I do think that within the institutional framework, a key question is, how good a conflict climate do you have? How good is in your team or the people you work with protected the capacity to share differences? To not only like you, but to hate you also sometimes. To be able to really, because when you're working in a conflict setting, you're eating conflicts all day long. And somehow you need to ventilate this. And usually you ventilate it by trying to exaggerate the harmony. You don't want to discuss, you don't want to talk more about conflict. You get at a stage where, you know, you'd like to watch TV or get rid of the whole thing. And you can't. And you need sort of spaces that sort of oblige you to reconnect to this. And I think this is very difficult. And we know smaller stages, all of us, we all know that very often when we get home from work, there's an initial feeling of, I can't communicate to anybody anymore. And best thing is to turn on the TV or, you know, sort of disconnect. And then usually, when sometimes we don't do that, but we manage to reconnect to our partners, to start talking, to do something, usually psychologically it does a lot better. But there's like this initial inertia to overcome when you want to become stupid and to sort of say, no, I'll reconnect. So I think there are small things like that that play a very important role. And I guess along the years, I've become much more conscious of when I reach my limits. there are moments where I can't listen anymore. There are moments where I'm too tired. There are moments when simply I am not able to work anymore. And I feel less guilty about it nowadays. When I was younger, I very often felt that I had to continue anyway. And nowadays I've learned that actually it doesn't not only not hurt people, it's a lot better for my effectivity to be able to acknowledge when I'm simply finished for the day, or for the moment, or when I need a break, or that's one thing. And the second thing is, I'm rather confident these days of not having to understand everything, and to acknowledge that. I allow myself to ask a lot more, and I allow myself a lot more to express when I don't understand something. And I think, especially when we work in different cultural and social contexts, which are not our own, we're all the time exposed to huge levels of cultural misunderstandings. And I think it's very, very important to protect and acknowledge that, sort of to deal with it very, very, very consciously. I don't know if that's...
Merci, oui. Après toutes les définitions données des conflits proposés par les célèbres personnages ici, j'aimerais savoir, est-ce que le concept de conflit n'est pas une stratégie pour certains afin de dominer les autres? Afin de dominer les autres personnes, quoi. Parce que j'ai remarqué, malgré le traumatisme coloniaux, politiques, économiques, voire même les calamités naturelles que l'Afrique a subies, mais jusqu'aujourd'hui, les conflits continuent toujours à sévir en Afrique. Et à chaque fois qu'il y a des conflits, on voit les médiateurs défiler tout le temps, viennent tout le temps. Mais plus les médiateurs défilent, plus les conflits prennent une grande ampleur. Donc on n'arrive jamais à résoudre les conflits. Alors pourquoi? Est-ce que ce n'est pas une stratégie pour dominer les autres? Ça c'est la première question. La deuxième question...
Should I continue? Okay. He said, in spite of all the nice definitions that we have heard here of conflict, he's wondering if the concept of conflict is not something invented in a way to dominate over others, because he just observes that in Africa, in spite of all Africa has suffered, well, conflict always goes on, and mediators keep coming, but the more mediators and peacemakers coming, but the more mediators come, the more it seems that the conflict grows.
Ça, c'est la deuxième question. Est-ce que le conflit est un phénomène naturel ou un fait de la société? Merci. Je vais le décrire. Bon, je dis que la société, bon, ça dépend c'est-à-dire des termes. Je peux dire que c'est naturel, je peux dire que c'est un construit.
So then is society natural or not? Because it depends. I could say it's natural, I could say it's something natural.
Parce que dès que les hommes se retrouvent à vivre ensemble, ils forment une société.
Because as soon as human beings get to live together, they form a society.
I think, and I say that before, I do think that conflicts are part of every social human development, and that happens not to be natural. And humans are really natural. Because humans have the strange capacity to at least pretend to shape their destiny. They personally act, they think about what they're acting. So, nothing will happen to human beings is natural. It's always a mixture of constructions, natural aspects, and I think conflict is part of human relationships, and I don't think that conflict, as I defined it before, in itself is good or bad. I think it's good because it's alive. But, and I agree with you very much there, I think that what I've said here about imperial tendencies in trauma work is something that can be said very much also in reference to conflict and peace building. Because many of the international mediators and many of the peace builders undoubtedly aren't mutually intervening in a conflict, but they're part of international power structures. And the mediation and the peace building is part of the ongoing international conflicts. So none of this is neutral. It's part of our post-colonial reality. And I don't think that makes it in itself bad or good. I just think it's a reality. If the German government sends me to Gaza, I'm not just David Becker, the psychologist. I'm part of a very complicated structure in which my country happens to be not neutral at all, and which they play, by the way, a very active and often very questionable role towards Israel and Palestine. And I become part of a political triangle which has very doubtful aspects. And all I'm saying is that I think the conflicts exist anyway, but I think the conflicts are shaped by much of what I have tried to describe today. But when we try to transform them, to deal with them, we're evidently also part of the problem. And that's what I've been trying to describe, is that we might be part of the solution, but we're always part of the problem. Whenever we work in certain circumstances, we are becoming part of this intervention strategies. And there are undoubtedly many situations where people would have been better off without any intervention. There I completely agree with you. But I think the problem doesn't solve so easily. It's not so easily to say either we intervene or we don't, either we're good or we're bad. It's much more complicated. Either I'm imperialist or I'm not imperialist. I think it's much more contradictory. And I think that the only thing we can do is we can very consciously deal with this contradiction in the practical interventions we have. I remember I once sat in Sierra Leone with a group of educators working in preschools, and supposedly we were talking about trauma. And it became very obviously, very quickly, that actually they had all visited lots of trauma courses, but had no real notion of trauma. When I asked them what is trauma, they said, well, we learned in our courses PTSD symptoms, and we learned that in war you get traumatized. So the children have been traumatized in war because their parents were killed or something like that. But none of the educators had ever linked this idea of trauma to themselves, for example. Some of them had suffered, some of them had been raped, some of them had been mistreated by the priests in the church where they were working horribly, and most of them had suffered genital mutilation, but they had never related this trauma issue to themselves. So what we did when I found out about that, what we did is we started translating the term trauma into their local languages. And then they invented 8 different terms for trauma. Love trauma, money trauma, war trauma, many situations. Actually, we all had to laugh. It was very funny, very joyful. And we found many words for trauma. And to be very honest, in a strict way, we weren't really doing trauma training the way I was supposed to do it. But in a practical way, we were inventing together something which for them made it useful to think about. And I was lucky that at that stage, the people who were paying for me accepted this work. Now, we continued the work, and we started talking about many issues, war trauma, and so on, but it also became clear that many of the educators had suffered themselves very difficult issues, basically because they belonged to the Catholic Church, and they were in their Christian communities, you know, the quote-unquote fallen women who were doing the childhood education, and many of them were suffering very strongly from their priests. Now, it so happened that I was being paid by a Catholic organization in Germany to do this work. Now, the Catholic organization let this go on for 6 trainings, and then they said, thank you very much. We don't want any more of this, because you were supposed to teach about war trauma. You weren't supposed to deal with female gender-specific violence, and even less with gender-specific violence related to the Catholic Church. So the project ended there. That happens. In this case, I said, if I'm not allowed to do that, I don't want to work with you on this. Then I prefer to stop. Nevertheless, it was a very painful thing because together with the colleagues we had established a rather good relationship. And we had to end the training sort of saying, we're really sorry. We started building up something with you, but now we'll have to cut it off because we're not being paid anymore and because the organization doesn't want it. And that wasn't an easy, nice political decision either, because somehow we were leaving the colleagues alone. And I'm telling you this because I think these power games always play a role in these kind of things. And the best we can do is make them obvious. But we cannot avoid them. We're not outside.
The interventions that we just tackled, but more specifically focusing on what we could call, I don't know, the ethics of psychosocial interventions. You mentioned in your presentation how difficult it was to have an actual impact in certain contexts due to the limitations of funding, certain programs, limitations of time available for psychologists to actually do anything. So the question I would ask is, in your experience, what should we do in contexts where the level of traumatization, whether individual or collective, I don't want to go back to the debate about that, but it's extremely high. I'm speaking from the perspective of my own work with Iraqi refugees in the Iraq Operation Unit of the UNHCR, where we have in Syria, where I work, today a little bit less than a couple of years ago, but still about 200,000 refugees registered in our database, where according to our latest investigations, as much as 50% have been victims of extremely severe violence, individual attacks, tortures, kidnappings, etc. Is there anything we can do, or should we leave morally the responsibility of healing to the natural mechanisms that exist in every society? Because we are now in a time where we are building some psychosocial programs, actually. That's why I'm interested in your opinion.
I think we have many areas or circumstances like the ones you're talking about where the problem is so massive that it's obviously ridiculous to imagine that you will just send therapists there. Now, in general, I'm not sure if the typical therapeutic model is the best model to deal with such issues. I think if you can, in many places, you will need sooner or later some kind of professionalization to deal with it. But what I've been trying to explain today is, or what I hope to show you a little bit, is that way beyond typical limited psychological interventions, all of you can, must, and should deal with traumatization issues when they confront you. So, in a case like you're talking about right now, for me the question is not, should you leave it, or should you try to get money to send thousands of psychologists in? But I think you should do something, but you should do something within the limits of what you can do.
Precisely, that was my question. Is that, even medically speaking, a good idea? Because, I mean, I'm not a psychologist myself, but I imagine that sometimes opening certain Pandora boxes is extremely
that is where I'm completely convinced you're not opening up a Pandora box. What you're doing is that you are maybe offering a possibility to contain a Pandora box. Because don't trick yourself. People who've suffered these things, they deal with them. They deal with them in their houses, they deal with them hitting their wives, they deal with them talking to their children, they deal with them. So it's not, are we opening up an area that once we open it up, it'll sort of explode in our faces. But the question is, how and where do you contain whatever is happening?
Right, but you still, I agree with that point, but at the same time, you cannot deny the fact that you can raise hopes in certain people. I'm seeing some of my colleagues working in that PSS, psychosocial support field, taking now, since recently, certain cases of single women victims of mass rapes, etc. And I'm wondering what they are doing. Because
so
yes, these women are expecting something from them.
So do I. Therefore, I'd say, evidently, if you do something, you have to really think about what you can do. And I think, for example, that if you say, in that community, we have to take up this issue in a better way, it's basically the question, how do you take it up in a community self-empowering orientation? And if what your colleagues begin to do is to do individual consultations, I think they're way off mark. And I wouldn't recommend that. I think it's difficult to avoid that because you start talking, you start asking, and then people come up to you and say, can I talk to you? And they begin to treat you like a magician. No matter how well you're prepared or not. You're an outside person, you all know that. We speak easier about these things to outsiders than we do to insiders. Very often when you come to communities, nobody talks to each other, but they'll talk to the first foreigner coming by, no matter if he's a psychologist or a football player. They'll talk to you and they'll tell you what and then you're with the problem. So I think your first task is to say, can we organize this? What is sort of running wild on us now? And if we organize this, where do we put the focus? What can we do and what do we have to avoid? I would think, yes, you would have to avoid individualized counseling, because then you're raising hopes that you cannot fulfill and your staff isn't prepared for that. So you have to talk about how do we deal with it when people ask individualized care. Second question, how can you pick up the issue within the communities you're working with anyway, and what kind of structures within the communities can be used to talk about this? I'm strongly against, for example, the quick teaching of therapeutic techniques to deal with these issues. Many colleagues make their life doing therapy teaching in a quick way in these places. Congo right now is a place full of strange therapeutic techniques where each developmental organization brings in their own little guru to fuck up the population. Excuse me, I really get angry about it. And I think that shouldn't be done. But I do think that you will find usually a lot of local resources you can work with. You usually find, when you think about it, that you can connect this kind of trauma work much more to the things that you usually do than you would really think of. So, for me, the basic question is, does a project sit down and, when you're working with a community ECIS with these and that characteristics, can you sit down and develop the psychosocial perspective strongly linked to what you're doing anyway? And then see the very little extra activities that you might have to develop. And in terms of do no harm, avoid entering into a situation you probably can't deal with. And I think one of the problems we have is that in many places people then at a certain point come up and begin to ask, we need something. And then you want to help, and then you're already lost in not being able to answer. I don't know if that answers a little bit your question, because the next step would be to sit down and say, what is it exactly you're doing? And then we could determine maybe together what would be a meaningful and effective way to include more psychosocial dimensions into your work.
Might be in touch.
Yeah. Yes?
Yeah. Oh, were you?
Sorry, but now you have the microphone. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, regarding what you were discussing, Lorenzo?
It's the stuff.
What?
It's stuff the
Like this?
Yes.
I was wondering what your position would be regarding whether to address or not directly the issue of what these people have been going through. And I'm referring to the fact that, from what I can see, at some point debriefing was the thing to do. And then it seemed that it seems to me that it's moved to the other end. And now there's sort of a consensus around the fact that debriefing is the bad thing, and that you should. I've heard about programs where, like for instance, I've heard about a program for the kids surviving. I can't remember the name of this place in Russia where they have this school hideout. Yes, exactly. And so they could do sports and creative activities and that sort of things, but never ever just discuss what had happened. And yeah, I'm wondering what's your opinion.
The key problem is that debriefing is typical short-term technique. The idea is, I ask you, you talk, I contain you, you're off better.
Okay.
And it doesn't work like that. And therefore debriefing techniques have proven to be clearly insufficient, because a couple of months later people continue to feel very bad about it. And because debriefing without relationship, again, is not useful. Now, if you look at it more in detail, it becomes very obvious that working on trauma is not something you can solve in a couple of sessions or in a couple of conversations. So it's a very long-term issue. And then you're absolutely right the way you describe it. Now we've got it the other way around. First we had this debriefing was everything, and now it's, oh, let's just work on resources, let's not touch the trauma. So we reinforce capacity of resilience, and we reinforce capacity of people to deny. And that's just as bad, if you ask me. I'm very much in favor of talking through things.
Okay.
But I'm not in favor of doing that under any circumstances. If I don't have the relationship to you, I prefer that you not talk to me. And I might even stop you if I don't know that I can come back and we can continue to work together. I don't believe in the almighty power that whenever I've started talking and I feel better. We have these support programs all over the world where people say, well, I'm doing support. And what they mean is they sit down with the people, talk to them a little bit, and then, because somebody told them, believe that magically they should feel better. Nobody feels better on the long range of these things. Short range, yes, with a little bit of talking, feeling less lonely, you usually feel better. So I think it's complex, and I think the problem we have is that there is no short-term treatment for these traumatic situations. They're all long-term, they're all complex, and there are no simply constructed answers. But my opinion is very clear. I think, first of all, I think people talk, and by the way, this has been researched. Holocaust survivors were researched, for example, and what was found out that it wasn't the Holocaust survivors who weren't willing to talk about concentration camps. It was their therapists who did this work. That's what originally was called the conspiracy of silence. Children talk about these things. The question is if the adults around them will allow them to talk or not, and how they'll pick it up. Or if they get offered the chance, either you do debriefing or you do sports. I mean, could you like to do both? And if you do both, could you check what kind of surrounding and to whom you're talking, and who's scared, more scared of what, on which side? So, I think I'm not one of those persons who think that you can. I said it the first night here, I think the key issue is acknowledgement and listening. But I think acknowledgement and listening implies a relationship. And when you have a relationship, then you can do that. We didn't have time to talk about it. I was going to tell you a little bit about Tadzhikistan. I worked there for 3 years with a group of 14 people. And we got to know each other really well. I think. And therefore, I think it was acceptable that we talked about certain issues. I would have never talked about them just coming there for a small visit.
Maybe the last question.
Thank you. I would like to get back to this dimension of collective dimension of trauma. And you said that you are not, you don't like the idea of the term collective trauma because trauma is individual phenomenon, if I understood it correctly. But what just came to my mind was that the war, for example, is a social phenomenon that provokes individual trauma. Well, this is just a reflection, but I'd like to extend this psychosocial level, and I had in mind the Ukrainian situation. Sometimes we call a society as a sick society, not using the word trauma because there was no war, but the society is sick because it has suffered a 20 years experiment and there is no results in a positive way. Some may say it is okay, there is no war, still keeping peace, etc. But rapid social change with bad consequences of this change provoked some social pathologies. This term social pathologies were maybe, I just seen this in one book of, a collective book of Ukrainian sociologists and psychologists, and they defined it as symptoms of a sick society. And I'm just interested, what do you think about this social dimensions of sickness within the society?
You know,
and how can individuals cope with this situation? If you have some, I don't know, it is not easy just to say, do this, that, and that, and you will be okay. But if you have something to say about coping with this situation.
You know, I think we all play around with metaphors, and I can live with that. And when I get angry, I can say, this and that society is really sick. Yeah, sure. The question is, what does that explain? Is it a model that explains something? And if yes, what does it explain? What does it help you to make this psychopathological analogy? And one thing it does clearly is that it sort of makes the whole thing look more controllable. You know, it gives you the impression you could really deal with a complete society. You know, if you just get to the bottom of the problem. And the analogies have always been like that. In Latin America, for example, the dictatorships, the only thing they did was fight the cancer of communism. So the way to do that was to kill all the communists. It's the same way surgery functions. Nazis decided that they had to fight this sick element. So the analogy of illness in political discourse is, I don't know, it's thousands of years old. And I have understanding of it. But as an element of social analysis, I think we have to be very careful with these analogies. Although I do think that if you define this whole thing well, you can get somewhere. For example, I do think that when you lived in war and persecution for a long time, and you have social realities in which the law of the person with a weapon is the law, then evidently you have a distortion of social relationships on a very basic level, because people get used to this, and the social norm becomes this kind of abuse. And I do believe that this is rather sick. But I would still be rather reluctant to not discuss this, first of all, as a social and political phenomenon, and to differentiate how each individual psychologically relates to this collective norm. So again, I'm very much in favor of differentiating things. And beyond how much I like the word collective trauma, what I'd like you to sort of stay with, or hate it, what I'd like you to stay with is the possibility to at least sometimes try to think on both levels instead of supposedly integrating them, or you don't really integrate them. Just risk jumping back and forth. It will already open you new perspectives.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I think that's a very nice closing word.